всех приветствуем. Занимайте, пожалуйста, те места, на которых физически никого не находится.
Please take seats if you are able to do. In a minute we will begin.
Завершение движения. Друзья, занимайте свободные места.
Dear friends, please take the free seats. I'm sorry if you're keeping the seats for your friends and acquaintances, but it looks like all the seats are taken and we have a full house.
Пока мы завершаем рассадку, позвольте, буду начинать еще раз.
And with your permission, I would like to begin. I would like to welcome the experts, our panelists, and those who are still joining us here. We have a very interesting topic, the world in Russia in the midterm prospects, global economic trends. And as for me, I like the word midterm because we are not going to speak about the abstract long-term prospects. It's all good, high economic growth and real income, low inflation, etc. But we are going to speak about the midterm. What is a midterm prospects and how do we define it? I guess we're speaking about the horizon of 1, 2, 3 years, and we have a great expert panel today. With your permission, I would like to introduce them. And translation, do we have a translation?
Давайте попробуем также попросить перевод. Отлично. Итак.
Okay. Okay, so the experts translation, do we have translation? Can you hear us?
Есть? Отлично.
English, do you have translation? Maxim Oreshkin, Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, Ksenia Yudaeva, the Deputy Head of the Central Bank of Russia, Esko, Chairman of the Board, East Office of Finnish Industries, and Prime Minister of Finland, 91 to 95. Jakob Frenkel, the Chairman of the Board, JP Morgan Chase International, and Chairman of the Bank of Israel from 91 to year 2000. And Adam Tooze, Professor of the History, Columbia University. And unfortunately, you do not see it, but we also have an expert on the first row, Francisco Ansers. I'm sorry for possibly mispronouncing, the head of the World Bank Development Outlook Group, and Sergei Drobushevsky, the Scientific Director, Gaidar Institute for Economic Policy. And let's engage in discussion. My last remark, and without further ado, I would like to have a discussion. Now, of course, we will have some basic questions and statements, but I'm asking all the participants to comment, to doubt, to challenge, and to criticize. And first of all, we have to understand what are our economic prospects. And Maxim, what do you think about the global economy outlook? And we're speaking about a horizon from 1 to 3 years. So what do you see as for the economic outlooks and what the government should be ready for? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, if we look at the outlook and forecast we've seen 1 year ago, the trend for the deceleration of the global growth was identified. We expect that the growth will decrease down to 3% within the next several years. And I really like the IMF prospects that eventually all good. They reconsider their forecast that it's going to be good as soon as any volatility or crisis, starts. They flip the size and it's all looks good. And thank God we have a more stable story in the topic of slowing down of the midterm economic growth. We've been speaking about the end of the recovery growth of such economies as the USA and Eurozone, structural slowing down of the high-growing India and China, and thirdly, problems in those countries where there is an unbalanced balance of payment, and these problems identify themselves in such countries as Argentina and Turkey. And we have the latest data about Turkey, the drop in retail sales and industrial output about 6%. Very deep crisis in Turkey. And of course, we can see the long-term trend for the slowing down of the rate of economic growth. We've been looking at that. And as for the hopes that the world will be growing very fast, we never had this hope. And around this trend, we can see volatility, and we are in the period, in the negative period. The last data shows that European growth is decelerated. Germany posted 1.5% of growth only in a year. And as for other countries, even in developing countries, we can see the problems I've mentioned about Turkey, and in countries like Mexico, we can see the debt problems with the Amex company. For Argentina, I've mentioned about, and there are some other countries where we do not see this trend so pronounced, but the problems are accumulating. USA and China, trade case and trade war, which is going on. We can see that China lately, the data for trade, it's a decrease in import and export year on year. And of course, all of this is right now brought us into such a negative curve and negative deviations from this midterm trend. Actually, do you think the global economy will end up in recession or in the growth? Do you get into global recession the way it was in 2008? Something very extraordinary should happen. But even the very big slowdown, while previously we've been saying that the global growth is 3.7 on average, but even going down to 3% would mean very big changes for the all economies, including the Russian. And I would like to give the floor to Ms. Francesca Ansorgi. Your expectations as the head of the World Bank, have they justified themselves? You've published the Darkening Sky or the Dark Sky report. What kind of clouds or dark skies that you've been speaking about in your report? Could you please give the microphone? I've seen a mic runner. Please help us with the microphone.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. So yes, twice a year we publish our Global Economic Prospects report. And we've just published. We do see the global economy slowing, like Minister Oreshkin has already said. We see it slowing, but in a very gentle way. For now, we expect global growth to still remain above potential and in line with the long-term 30-year average. Where we see the darkening skies is in the risks. Less in the baseline, more in the risks. And there are two risks in particular we see to global growth. The first is pertaining to financial market turmoil or dislocations. My predecessor has already touched on this. Yes, last year financial conditions tightened considerably for emerging markets and developing economies. For now, most emerging markets have managed quite well with this, with two exceptions that you've touched on already. The risk is going forward, there'll be more disruptions and countries will not manage so well. So that's the first risk for the global economy that we looked at in detail. The second risk is the risk of the possibility of escalating trade tensions. For now, the tariffs that were actually implemented in 2018 only account for 2.5% of global goods imports. Even if everything that's been discussed and has not yet been implemented was implemented, it would be 5% of global goods exports. Not much yet. The problem is it's happening between the two largest economies in the world, the US and China. They account together for 20% of global trade, 40% of global GDP. If these two economies slow together, it will reverberate around the world. So we estimate, for example, if growth slows in both of them together by 1 percentage point, it would reduce global growth by about between 3/4 and 1 percentage point. That's a slowdown. That's not a recession. We don't see a recession.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frenkel. A short comment, would you please? Yes, we would like to engage in discussion. Speaking about the global trends, we should not have a mechanistic look. We should not see the tariffs. It's important to understand it's not only about tariffs. We're speaking about the ban on technologies, the managers of the big corporations. It's a war which is being done not only within the tariffs. It's a war which is being waged in all fronts, and it's big changes in public moods. It's a shift in paradigm and change in the mood, which impacts more than any slight movements in the weighted average tariffs. And Ksenia Yudaeva, she's saying that I'm always pessimistic, but still a question for Mr. Frenkel. Jacob, before the discussion, you and I have been speaking about these topics, and you've been saying that you can see big risks of trade wars. And I would also add that, as a matter of fact, the Federal Reserves and the People's Bank of China do not do a stimulating monetary policy. Both of them are in neutral monetary policy. What do you think about that? Ksenia, what do you say? Yes, Oldeska, could you please comment it about the risks and how serious these risks are? And what's the probability that these risks would entail something? Thank you.
Thank you very much. As was discussed already, we are all sitting in an airplane. Some of us are sitting in first-class seats, even with champagne. Some of us are sitting in coach. And suddenly you hear in the loudspeaker a fight between the two co-pilots. It doesn't matter that I sit in a deep armchair with champagne. I will be very worried.
Champagne helps, anyway.
He is the producer of champagne, by the way. So, at the present time, the actual effects of the skirmishes that have taken place in terms of the actual tariffs that have already been imposed do not show in the data the gravity of the potential dangers. And it will be a mistake to take the narrow economist statistician and say, well, it's only 0.5% or 1%. It's a mindset. It's a mindset of openness to technology, of openness to ideas, of openness to people, of openness to trade. The damage, it's very difficult to educate the population that there is damage unless you come with data like the World Bank and others to show how many millions of people over the years have been pulled up and elevated out of poverty just because of having access to world markets, just because of having the ability to smooth and bridge their business cycles, that when we have a slowdown, I can borrow and lend and from them and vice versa. That's why it's so important that the skirmishes are translating itself into successful negotiations. And if we go later about the discussion of what needs to be done, we can elaborate. But I want to say one thing about the numbers. The impression is that the parties to the debate are the US and Europe on the one side and China on the other. This is what is in the headlines. The facts are that the total trade, the volume of trade between China and the US and Europe together is less than half than the trade between China and the rest of Asia. And we focus on this nexus where the action is elsewhere. And that's why, in a world of multilateral interconnectedness, it is misleading to think about a bilateral relation. And therefore, the machine is much more complex. And even if you don't see each and every screw in the machine, each and every screw can mess it up.
Господин Дус, пожалуйста, да.
And just to amplify that point, the United States economy is one of the least trade-open economies in the world. It has a very small share of exports and imports in GDP. Though it's the big actor in this drama, it's actually one of the economies which will be least directly affected, whereas the export-dependent economies of Europe or those tied into the East Asian manufacturing hub are really in the immediate firing line.
But isn't the threat that the United States is actually the trendsetter, kind of, in the macroeconomic space? What the US does is kind of fashionable, isn't it?
Well, so far it hasn't proved that way. I think the optimists see a kind of fairly comprehensive pushback from a variety of different actors. TPP, after all, has gone ahead even without the United States as an actor. The Japanese made considerable political concessions to sign up to it originally, and Abe hasn't pulled back from those. So it turns out that there is, in fact, a fairly substantial global coalition behind globalization, but exactly the reasons that Jacob mentioned. It has been, so obviously, a driver of growth, particularly in Asia.
Yes, please. Ksenia Valentin, what?
Very short comment on who is a trendsetter. I think China is a trendsetter as well. And you cannot understand what the US is doing now and Europe is doing without looking at China's, let's say, behavior. And that's why I think it's very important to understand that in spite of all this turbulence, there are also facts on the table. And I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, these two pilots will agree that in spite of differences, it's reasonable to fly together. And there are common interests to do that. But let's have a look. It's sometimes very difficult to be optimist, but in this case, I am.
Well, I think it's not difficult to be an optimist when you consider the alternative. So, the facts indeed are on the table. And we need to look at the substance. The US and the West have a legitimate claim when it comes to intellectual property rights on the technology and things like this. And it needs to be addressed. There is a fundamental difference in the DNA of governments between China and the US and Europe. The horizon of China today is the next century, 2025, or how well do they want to be down the road, beyond the life of current politicians in the West, for whom the horizon is much closer. So when you come to the table to negotiate, and each one comes from a very different perspective, it is both an opportunity to find a middle ground, but also an obstacle to find a common dictionary. And my last remark has to do about weights in the world. You know, you described the World Bank report that just came out. Many, many years ago, in fact, I'm embarrassed to say, more than 30 years ago, I was at the time the economic counselor and head of research of the IMF in charge of producing the World Economic Outlook. It was a very simple exercise. Quo vadis the world? The question was, where does the world go? The answer was, tell me where the US, West Germany, and Japan goes, and I tell you the world. 2/3 of world output was produced there. Today, the very same three countries, Europe, US, altogether 35%, and Japan, 35% of world output. Where did it go? It went to the emerging markets, primarily China, India, Asia, and others. Now, this is the reality of where the production takes place. The global economic order, the institutions that are supposed to be backing that reality have not adapted themselves to reflect that reality. Enough to see the debate about the proportional voting shares of China, India, other emerging markets. So the growth of emerging markets in reality has taken place dramatically. The growth of emerging markets in the international organizations has not carried through, and all of them read the principles of no taxation without representation, and don't expect countries that do not carry the weight in the decision to carry the weight in the responsibility.
Позвольте, я же Ксении Валентиновне передам.
With your permission, I will give the floor to Ksenia. Ksenia, following up on this image of two fighting pilots in an airplanes, looking at the CBR, Bank of Russia, the Bank of Russia seemingly. This metaphor of an airplane, speaking of Bank of Russia, what Bank of Russia is getting ready for, readying itself for? What risks are you envisioning, and what risks you believe we have to mitigate and to prevent? I will separate your question into two questions. What do we see in near term? And the second part of the question is possibly about reserves and how central banks see the situation in terms of availability of reserves and reserves management and so forth. Why do you think these are two different questions? It's like in banking, you have a business plan, you have a stress testing. Stress testing is different from a business plan. And this probably is not like too realistic. It's not a high probability situation. But still, we have to be ready for this situation should they happen. And when we are speaking about reserves, about the availability of reserves, their structure, of course, it's a certain perspective of the central bank. And we believe that we have to be ready for any scenario. And therefore, we are looking at tough scenarios, difficult scenarios, and we're getting ready for the worst scenarios. We're looking at the stories, we're looking at the history of the tough scenarios. This is our starting point of what we should be ready for. And now, concerning the situation on financial markets in the near term.
Basically, if 2017 was surprisingly stable, 2018 still was a year of high upheaval and instability in a broad set of markets. We mentioned already here emerging economies and markets experienced high volatility there in some cases. But if we take raw material markets, oil was 85, now dropped to 50, then dropped to 50, now it is 60 plus minus. Well, here we also see not so strong volatility as we had in 2014, but still quite a significant one. Then what we have, if we speak about the speed of drop, it was even faster than in 2014. If we take a look at stock markets in the US, there was a quite significant drop in the beginning of last year, and now we are living in a period of quite a high volatility in general. And this is not an extreme period, but a period of high volatility, which we should confirm. And of course, central bank and all central banks should provide tools at hand to react properly to this situation, to take into account how the situation could develop. And the only thing I wanted to underline about the causes of volatility, some causes lie in the handmade area, the trade war, which was already mentioned here at this panel, has some elements of handmade policy, and it's possible to turn the situation a little bit to some extent. There are also factors which could start compensate each other. For instance, there are big concerns in emerging markets exist regarding the strengthening of the Federal Reserve policy. But on the other hand, if we see the slowdown of the economic growth, the policy of Federal Reserve would change. We already see this. We see changing of expectations towards the policy for next year, this year and next year. And this already gives its impact to the markets. And once again, summing up from the point of view of the central bank and from the point of view of financial stability issues, it's very important to be ready for a broad palette of different cases and scenarios. Of course, thank you very much, Mrs. Yudava. We will come back to it. You sounded as an optimist, very expressed one. Why are you so optimistic? In Europe, by the end of 2018, there were weak values, weak indicators. We can discuss it, of course, but the region is for sure is under global slowdown, chronicle issues with inflation. It's low. But why do you think that everything is so optimistic going forward?
Optimistic, but optimistic anyway. I believe that these handmade and man-made problems are actually easier to be solved than what we expect. But I'm more worried about long-term challenges. We have a technological revolution going on. Europe has not been very successful, and that's one reason why growth rates in Europe have been lower than in the US or China. Secondly, we have aging of population, and that is a dramatic change that is taking place now. And I believe that it has already major impact in economies. Actually, I have to mention that we are going to organize in Finland first ever silver economy conference next summer. Silver economy is there. We are looking like that as well. But it has major impact on growth potential as well. And then these environmental and sustainability challenges as well. I think that they will have major impact in economies. That's why I think that in spite of all these turbulences now, we have to keep our eye on these, let's say, long-term issues as well. And finally, why I'm optimistic. We have had earlier in history times when we have had several, let's say, economic global powers. But never before these powers have been so much linked to each other's and dependent on each other's than they are today. And that is something completely new. Think about the Soviet Union and the United States, the Cold War position. They were against each other's, and interaction links between these two economies were zero, close to zero. But in today's world, all are dependent on each other's, and that's why when looking at these two pilots, the United States and China, for example, they are so much interlinked that if you want to hit another, you will hit yourself as well.
Господин Тусов, вот в продолжение у вас...
Mr. Tusa, you just recently issued a book related to crisis, and you call decades of crisis, you determine decades of crisis in this context.
Все-таки вот...
Well, in the context of your view, or long-term view, is there any reason for optimism? How should we consider the current situation? Maybe it's a crisis of 2008, but in different forms. What do you think?
So I think intermediating, if you like, between the short-term perspective of the volatility in financial markets of the last year and the very long-term time horizon that was just opened up. The other thing, of course, that we have to reckon with, less in Russia, but certainly in the West, is that we're still dealing with the problem of normalization. The extraordinarily delicate balancing act which the Fed is performing, which is exerting pressure on emerging markets around the world, is after all still the long-term legacy of the massive liquidity push and monetary expansion that Ben Bernanke initiated, which had a hugely positive effect at the time, but has produced global dislocations which we're still working out. And in Europe, we're only literally just witnessing the end of QE, precisely at a moment that the European economy is slowing down. So I think that would be the other time horizon that I would want to insert, which is more a matter of a decade, maybe a decade going forward as well, rather than the really long-term historic time horizon. As to the long-term issue, I think one thing we have to learn to do is to dissociate ourselves from irrelevant histories. So Europe and Japan are haunted by their extraordinary growth experiences in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. That has been normalized as an experience that is the benchmark against which you judge our current disappointment. But in fact, those growth rates of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in Japan were totally exceptional in historical terms, absolutely radically beyond the norm. The 19th century industrial revolution was a matter of growth rates of 1, 1.5%, 2% per annum. Even in Tsarist Russia, which was one of the great hubs of the late 19th century growth boom, or in Gilded Age America in the late 19th century, the per annum growth rates were very, very modest by our standards today. So what we have witnessed in China is a true epic in human history because it has those rapid growth rates of the European and Asian experience, but at the level of 1.4 billion people. And that truly is a radical departure. It's what economic historians like to call the hockey stick. It's this discontinuity in human experience in which poverty stops being the fate of the majority of mankind. So that, on the other hand, predisposes to a structural optimism. Even if China were to now slow down, it would be at a level which poses problems of affluence, like climate change, no longer problems, however, of misery and underdevelopment and stunted human growth.
Сразу два вопроса, и вот у нас еще один.
Two questions and one comment. A question comes to my mind, and I would ask all the English participants to comment on. Why it was an extraordinary period, exceptional period? One of the answers is to have an opportunity to play with the state debt, and the amount of the accumulated debt in the global economy is one of the things which was not mentioned, but still are a risk. But it's a Mars planet. It exists somewhere and it doesn't bother you, but any moment can happen something bad. Sergey, let's start with you. Your comment, and maybe you will comment on this answer. Please, could you take a microphone? Thank you very much. I just wanted to pay attention to one moment. There was an example with pilots. The problem is not just there is a fight between two co-pilots. The effect of trade wars that we experienced, but there's also a problem that still after the crisis 2009, 2008, we can't be sure that pilots feel well as they are in good health, because the problems which were detected in 2008, 2009, and which partially were the reason for so long a recovery after the crisis, they just didn't disappear for the decade. Europe is still suffering under the debt issue, and in the last year the cases of Greece, Italy, maybe France now, due to the problem of migrating to the harder budgeting policy, none of these issues is solved and was solved, and still these issues are not growing to a global, to a deeper crisis. It doesn't mean that they disappeared. Similar problems are accumulating in the US because the Trumponomics, well, gives good indicators, but as you know, many opponents of Trump say that there could be limits for this economics, especially now on the eve of the second term elections. It may have positive results, but going forward after 4 years, there could be slowdown and debt problem. In the same way as China, problems of excessive financial sector and accumulated debts. This problem still exists there too. So I'd like to pay your attention to this aspect too. Thank you very much, Maxim Stanislavovich. If we take a look at the problem of the debts, we shouldn't consider it only from the point of view of the debt level. We should understand what debt is directed to which expenses, and what is the response from these expenses. It's a Russian position. If we take a look at the Chinese position, we can see that the total debts, state plus corporate, continues to grow, and from year to year, the efficiency of funding is dropping. First investments, huge investment infrastructure made in 2009-2010 gave huge results. Building a high-speed railway between Beijing and Shanghai is a high-efficiency project. It goes along densely populated territories and fully utilized. Now high-speed roads are built in remote places, in remote locations, and they are not utilized. With every next stage, with every next circle of innovations, if there is a skew somewhere to some side, well, obviously in China we have a skew to excessive structural investments. They efficiency is dropping and the whole system starts to shake, and both from the debt and leverage level and growth rate. If we remember the most negative facts about China, economists try to bury it for a long time already in terms of debt investment. But what changed drastically? That you were right, that efficiency of the previous model of growth is going down. Now they're going to the taxation stimulation, they reduce VAT, and they try to restart economic growth or at least stabilize it. Then my question is about real risk, but they have accumulated debt. You mentioned that in the emerging economies there are a lot of countries in the sector of risk. In China, the rates in RMB and yuans are almost equal to $2, and yuan profitability will be lower than dollars. The debt level is much less risks other than potential dynamics and the structure. If it's an efficient debt, if it's stabilized and clear dynamics, any debt level is a manageable situation. The situation goes out of control when the debt keeps growing, the trajectory goes wherever we don't know, and this situation is becoming unstable. And if we take a look in the dynamics and not on aesthetics in terms of the debts, then it might be okay. Mrs. Yudaeva, please, your comment on the monetization. The Federal Reserve is the only big bank which allowed to significantly strengthen the monetary policy, but we also have examples of economies which fell sacrifice to the growth of debts and growth of dollars, so from 2 trillion to 4 trillion in the last decade. What are the risks, on your opinion, in this regard? You know, I thought about this analog and example with pilots. If you fly a plane where is not very well, which is very well concluded, it would be good that everyone has a parachute. And in passenger, it won't help. Yes, I understand, but I think when we speak about countries flying on a plane, it's closer not to a passenger plane, but a military plane, maybe. Well, it's not possible to jump out of the plane at the height of 10 kilometers, you know, even if you have a parachute. You understand very well the situation. The leaders of Russia, they are ready for everything, even for jumping off the plane with a parachute at 10 kilometers. So nevertheless, well, of course, in such situation, there are issues about some dampers, some reserves for developing economies. This issue is very important. The issue of reserves means absence of macroeconomic imbalances, absence or maybe a quite stable financial system, internal system. What are the concerns? Concerns are related to the inflow of capital. QE resulted in a huge influx of capital to developing countries, and the high level of debts, especially and most probably, and first and foremost in the corporate sector, not only in the state sector. And so moving away from QE would have the equal outflow. We haven't experienced so far yet, but we already have theories that maybe saying that maybe the market structure changed, and now main companies who are holding these companies, these are managing companies, asset management companies, not banks, and they might be less sensitive to the change of Federal Reserve policy. But the future would show, the history would show how the situation would go. But of course, the risks related to the moving away from QE are still on the agenda. Everyone is afraid of this. But how economies will be impacted, especially those who have a high debt load. About the debt load and the level of leverage, here, of course, the world is testing different levels. We have Japan, we didn't mention a lot. And if we speak about leverage and state debt, this is the champion, by the way, and this is the internal debt. You can compare it to the Great Britain, but in the UK, the market has the specifics that all debt is concentrated in London City. In Japan, they have the global internal debts. They are not growing, and expenses are not so efficient. But still, this system continues to survive. But we couldn't say it's quite efficient. Well, obviously, in this regard, there are a few options, a few ways of development. Of course, the task for everyone is to find variants and ways of development which wouldn't result any big upheavals or slowdown of the economic growth. Just for a second, I wanted to come back to the emerging markets issue. When you, Nikolay, asked question that the growth rates, the rates income growth in the US resulted in crisis, but in Turkey, in other countries, is not due to the errors in the policy. But where is thin, there is a breakdown. You know, there's a breakdown not because of the external situation, but because of internal errors. Just take a look at the Russian case. The lessons we learned from the crisis of 2014. If Mrs. Yudaeva already mentioned the oil price dynamics, if we take a look at the drop in October, December. In global, in 2018, it was a little bit faster than it was in 2014. But the answer and the reaction we saw on the financial markets in the economics is drastically different, absolutely different from 2014. And this is related to macroeconomic structural reforms, which Russia carried out, and the central bank, inflation targeting, floating rate, all these set of measures allowed to make Russia protected and safe from external volatility.
And now we have actually two cases. We're going to look at these two cases. Maybe in 5 years later, we'll have another panel session. Turkey and Argentina have chosen totally different ways, and we will see whether institutes will help them. I mean, the market institutes, and what will be the results of these two policies. Mr. Tusam, you also wanted to mention, Mr. Tus.
Of Jacob's fantastic image. So imagine you sit down in the airplane and they leave the mic on and you hear them discussing the fact they've just been to aerial acrobatics school and have learned how to do the loop-the-loop. That, I think, is something akin to what the situation we're in right now. The central bankers have learned to do the loop-the-loop. That is what QE demonstrated, that you could do extraordinary innovative policies without any immediate negative consequences. And one of the key elements about the global debt situation is to view it not just from the side of what productive purpose it was put to, but who is lending the money. Far too often we think about debt as nothing more than a burden on taxpayers, for instance, or on the revenue stream of corporations. These are also assets. The world needs safe assets. One of the things that happened in 2008 is a gigantic class of supposedly safe assets, securitized mortgages, evaporated. There is apparently limitless demand for American government debt, though of course Treasury yields are going up and there is now a substantial spread between them and bunds. But nevertheless, there is a global appetite for safe assets, which in the Japanese case is fed entirely domestically. The Italian case is quite similar. But the US, if you look across the global fiscal picture right now, is the only global issuer of substantial quantities of AAA rated government securities with a deep market to back them up. There's an amazing IMF table which shows this stark reality. So the entire power play in global bond markets is now centered in that one market. But it is a market with two sides. Of course, the Trump administration is sucking in money to feed its totally unsustainable fiscal policy, but there are also people willing to lend.
Господин Френкель.
Well, I feel guilty since I brought the two pilots to the discussion. But since Ksenia mentioned the parachute, I would like just to remind us all of Winston Churchill's dictum that markets are like parachutes. They work best when they are open. And that's a very important thing to remember. You mentioned the crisis. You know, a lot was discussed about crisis, and crisis in plural, crises. There is a saying that, of course, crises do not come out of the blue. There is a pregnancy. Normally, the crises arrive after we think they should have arrived. We become sanguine, but once they arrive, they hit harder than what we thought they would. The problem is that they are not stable, are not staying where they started. You talked about debt. One of the issues of debt is that excessive leverage creates vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that are not seen necessarily in an initial configuration of interest rates, but suddenly are hitting you when you realize that you also need to service the debt and return the principal, and maybe you have not done the right thing. That's where it starts. And if you have weak banks, a banking crisis can translate itself into a financial crisis. And a financial crisis, which looks like esoteric economist's problem, can translate itself into an economic crisis. An economic crisis that affects everyone is translating itself into a social crisis. And a social crisis that affects everyone is translating itself into a political crisis. And then you say it all started from the weak bank. Yes, there was a chain, and we better realize that these crises are best addressed when they are small and where they are still localized at the starting point rather than when they go out. One of the great lessons of the last crisis, I say last as of today, is the insights that came from the work of Rogoff and Reinhardt, which ask the question, why has it taken us 10 years to work it out and it's still not complete? And one of the answers is that when we need to distinguish between a crisis that affects the flows, production, consumption, which is temporary, versus a crisis that affects assets and balance sheets. A balance sheet crisis takes much longer to work out through the system. And it takes so much time that politicians lose patience with it and they don't realize exactly where they are. That's exactly the role of professionals, to explain the roadmap, how it goes. Nothing is random. When you ask me next about the monetary policies, I will come back again because I don't want to extend my floor.
Actually, you're welcome to if you feel like it right now.
So you took, since we spoke about the air and about pilots, let's go to the ocean and talk about boats. So when the crisis erupted in 2007, 2008, etc., all the boats in the ocean were affected in the same way because it came at the same time and it spread itself like a fire in a bush, and immediately it happened. And if we did not realize that it was a global thing, the G20 met in London, took a photo opportunity, and we realize now we are in a global reality. All central banks all over the world have engaged in dramatic easing, calling it unconventional monetary policies. The unconventional monetary policies sounded at the beginning as dramatic, and being unconventional, they thought it will be a short term, otherwise they would call it a new convention. So it was unconventional at the beginning, and it lasted a long time. And as it lasted a long time, confusion came to the market. Are we in a new paradigm, or are we in a detour to be returning to the old paradigm? And that area really covered our clouds during the past decade. Now everyone understands that we are on the way out, but not all boats in that ocean are in the same place. The US is ready for the normalization, has been engaged in normalization, may go a little faster or slower, but it is clear where it goes. Japan is still going in the opposite direction. So a Martian coming down to Earth, taking a snapshot of the boats, will say they don't know what they are doing. One goes to the right, one goes to the left. And the reason is economic policy is not assessed by snapshots. It is assessed by time series. And indeed, we need to ask why Japan is still behind, why Europe is still behind. One of the reasons is they started later. But still, there are a lot of lessons there. Financial markets in the US are much more active than in other places, therefore transmissions are much faster. Funding in the US is primarily through capital markets, in Europe primarily through the banks. There are fundamental differences that explain all of that. But here comes the professional assessment. It all started from the excess leverage at the beginning. It all continued by the celebration that unconventional monetary policy gives us free luncheons. And it all comes back to haunt us now to say, don't assess the success of a journey until you land, not when you take off. And that's why when we go on the plane, we wish each other safe landing. We don't say safe takeoff, because the test is, will you land safely?
Thank you very much. Я бы еще напомнил, что монетарная.
And I would also remind that the QA, quantitative easing, was launched to stabilize the markets. It was invented by initially, there was no liquidity on the mortgage market. They were afraid of deflation. They were afraid of repetition of the Great Depression. They were afraid of deleveraging, and that this deleveraging will result in strong deflation, as it was during Great Depression. But the QE was stimulation for economy. There was a whole set of measures to address the liquidity problem, and a number of measures in the QE, as the large-scale investments of the American central bank system in different papers was aimed at stimulating of economic situation. Okay, let's not engage in this lengthy discussion of those times. They're long bygone. And now we're speaking about the aftermath. It's a one-way ticket, maybe the Federal Reserve and other banks bought this one-way ticket, but the American economy restored after the crisis. This is the main consequences. And the unemployment is below the natural level in the US. These are the consequences. And what's next? Next is business as usual. Business as usual. Okay, but how this business is going to look like? Do I understand you that the American economy simply was able to solve all of its problems? They were able to normalize the rates level, to maintain the balance. It will be a recession, the business as usual in America, Federal Reserve. No, there's a lot of problems, structural ones, but in terms of the Federal Reserve, it's shifting to normal policies, which had been existed before the year 2000. They've returned to that, and those risks which they are facing in terms of American economy, overheating, inflation growth, and so forth, the same problems which they've had in the beginning of year 2000. We do not deny, however, that on financial markets, in economy, there are different disbalances. What was the balance size? 800 billion with the Federal Reserve System now. When I was speaking about the debt, I was saying it's not about the volume, It's about dynamic of this debt, not about the statical picture, about dynamical picture. So we're looking, if you look at the size of the balance, it's a technical, number. Okay, and then let's look at all this discussion from a different angle, from the angle of developed countries and developing emerging markets, because it's not a synchronized development process in our economies. Even developed countries, as it was stated several times, have been synchronized. And developing countries oftentimes are living their own lives. Then how about Russia, Maxim? In this global context, we have a lot of challenges. The slowing down of the economic growth, and we can see at the markets are discounting some reflation, so-called reflation periods. How are we going to feel in the future? It depends on how efficient we will be here within Russia, because all that we're creating right now in terms of the global economy is saying to us that the global economy will not be able to pull the Russian economy out. The growth source, speaking about economic dynamics and sanctions and the trade wars, the global economy will not recover Russian economy. Only Russian economy can help itself. Within the very heavy demographics, we can pull ourselves out only through investments and the labor productivity increase. It's a long list about Ksenia. What would you say about the gold and currency reserves and this share of the renminbi in the gold and currency reserves? Isn't that parachute, or a golden parachute, should I say? Speaking of all reserves, since the Chinese renminbi became the par of our golden currency reserves, of all the global reserves, our central bank is holding 25% in renminbi. Would say so. But indeed, we are looking at different options. We're looking at different possibilities. We have big reserves, and we're seeing different scenarios. Where yuan or renminbi would be more interesting and other currencies may be more interesting to us. It's all the questions of diversification of our reserves. Again, on the case of different scenarios, once these scenarios present themselves. And the question to Maxim and to Ksenia, to both of you, still in our forecasts, we see the low rate growth. Even the economic ministries and the central banks, 3% we envision only by 2020 in Russia. And I believe that the central bank and the Russian government have adequate outlook. We are not overly optimistic, and even looking at the acceleration of economic growth that we have in our forecast in several years, there is a lot to do to see the acceleration in 2019, 2020, to get the growth close to 3% in 2021 in Russian. And like I said, the situation in the global economy is making it more difficult for us to attain these goals. It makes more important what we do within Russia, what kind of actions we're taking within Russia. Mr. Frenkel, in general, I would like to ask you about the developing countries. Those instances, we've seen some difficult cases, complex cases. Maxim Oreshkin has been speaking about the other points in other developing countries which are in the high risk zone. What do you think will be the destiny of these economies in the future? Thank you.
We have seen in the past several decades a big trend change. In the 70s, for example, or even in the 80s, when there was a crisis in the world, you immediately looked at the developing countries, primarily in Latin America. The last crisis only demonstrated that also the industrial countries are capable of producing a massive crisis, and it is even much more painful because it is global. Last year, the growth rate of emerging markets as a whole was more than double the growth rate of the advanced economies. So we are starting from that reality that emerging countries in the world have now larger share in world production and are growing faster than the other countries. Of course, is this a temporary phenomenon? The reality is, again, if you just look at China and India, countries with the two highest saving rate, you realize that if for each dollar that is produced, the US consumes 90% and China consumes only 50%, don't be surprised that China is accumulating assets from the rest of the world. This has nothing to do with exchange rate or with things of that type. It has to do with fundamental decisions of the Chinese citizens and the economy to forego current spending in order to have future benefits. It is done efficiently or inefficiently, that's a separate matter. Now, there are pressure points. You mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Argentina, you mentioned Venezuela. If you didn't, you should. Most of those cases are homemade. It is always tempting to policymakers to say, those are the foreigners. It's the environment. We are subject to shocks. Let's create walls. Let's prevent others from contaminating us with their diseases. In the examples that we mentioned, it is very simple. At least 90% of their misery comes from bad economic policies at home. And that's really, so you ask me, and what's the prescription? I think that the old textbooks are very helpful here. One of the damages of the unconventional monetary policy era was the notion that we are in a new universe and we can throw all dicta away and textbooks that we have learned over the history are not relevant anymore. Fortunately, we are coming back to the highway, and what it takes to do good economic policy, what was known over the past 30 years is still there. Responsible budget, structural policies, openness, all the kind of things, stability, independence of central bank, the right institutions. We know all that. We don't need to invent the wheel.
Jacob, I don't fully agree with you.
Good.
If you look back the history and different crises, early 1970s, Western world was hit by a dramatic crisis.
Oil shock.
Oil shock, but it was also a major financial shock. The whole monetary system was transformed and changed since the beginning of 1970s. And my comment is that actually, if you look at the crisis and potential of crisis, we need them. That's the only way how we can make corrections in the system. That's why crisis is a normal thing. I'm 65 soon, and I have seen every 10 years we have some dramatic changes. In 1970s we had financial crisis and two oil crises. In 1980s, eurosclerosis. Europe was in deep difficulties. Then the Cold War ended. We had crisis again, and now we have had financial crisis. Now we have Brexit, and so on and so on and so on. I think that is fundamental. That these economic and financial factors are linked to technological changes as well. And 1970s, we faced dramatic technological change. Now we are doing the same. It's not that visible, but we are moving to completely new type of economies. And I think partly we have to understand that in order to get out of this. And finally, when looking at debt levels, I fully agree with Minister that you should look at growth potential as well. If debt level can be rather high if you have good growth potential, but even low debt level is a huge risk if you don't have growth and growth potential, and that's why I'm worried about China, because China's growth rate goes down step by step. I'm not fully confident that 6-point-something figure is a real figure anymore. And that's why this view that China is strong and others are weak is probably not, on the longer term, the factual situation.
Mr. Frenkel, and then Ksenia Valentinova.
When you said you disagree, I thought it will be a profound disagreement. I agree with you, which is the best way to start disarming you, and now I will say something. No, but seriously speaking, throughout the recent history, decade, we have had quite a few of economic crises. If you look at their longer term implications, they end up being, by and large, a ripple, except for the oil shock that was in the early 70s. This one had dramatic implications that were much more profound. It carried with it changes in the political structure, changes in the questions about the debt recycling, if you remember, and all of that. So this was a very good example. But it begs another question, which is, there is always the argument of when there is a crisis, it's a good opportunity to shake the tree and have a new beginning. The question that I have is, isn't there a cheaper way to have a good beginning? And the cheaper way is to read the books that will be presented in few. No, the reason is this. History does not repeat itself, but it has a lot to teach. And I think that if one does get information, first he becomes less arrogant and some more humility, and second, he can prevent some of the difficulties. The statement that says, let's not waste the crisis, basically says, let's learn the lessons from it. And you don't need to have destruction. I remember that there was a period in which people said, what's the secret of the rapid success of then West Germany and Japan at the time in the post-war? And the answer was given because they were so much destroyed by the war that they could start from the beginning without having this excess luggage from the past. There must be a cheaper way to improve economies. And that's what I'm saying.
Позвольте вот один комментарий. Я запутался, честно вам скажу.
I'm a little bit confused in this state that in the Institute we were told that debt accumulation is not very positive thing after some level, some threshold. And there are some conditional borders after which, on definition, the efficiency of the additional debt burden is dramatically going down. Well, and coming back what was just mentioned, the main question, and we need to spend maybe to this question the rest of the time in our session, next recession, whether it will happen sooner or later. This is a principal systematic problem, like end of 20s and the early 30s in the US and then in 1970s, or is it just a typical conventional recession, just a small slowdown, a few quarters of negative growth, then rates down, budget increased, and everyone moves on? Ksenia Valentina, please, your comment. I will do my best to answer to the first part of the question. I'm actively involved in market potential regulation. Well, and the main indicator of macro potential regulation is not the debt level or leverage level, but it's most probably the payment. And when Maxim mentioned that what are the ways of investing this debt and what is the dynamic, if your debt is growing to the income, the payment, but the payment is not changed, what we really experienced in the previous years. So this situation is at least can be saved to some extent, to some level. The other thing is that we should answer the question why the payment to debt ratio didn't change, why interest rates didn't go down, and what is the probability of their dramatic increase. Japan, which we mentioned, was an exception because they have low rates and for years, even for decades. and the country still keeps accumulating debt, but nothing happens, good, no bad, well, and the risks are really coming from this side, whether the payment load may change, and all talks are going around the emerging economies and risks are going in the same area. During QE, everyone was borrowing very cheap, even at not very stable lenders. And now if rates would go up, what would be the result? As for the safety threshold, it's different. For someone, it's 20% is very high debts, and for some 200 can be survived in principle. Well, in principle, there's no single figure. The figure strongly depends on the full set of factors and the comprehensive analysis. The life is much more complicated than what you've been taught in the institute. Unfortunately, that's true. We can't argue this. Mrs. Diver, do you want to add some? Yeah. Well, speaking about the future recession, what is your subjective professional opinion? It's not suddenly you mentioned that I was dealing a lot with G20, and we shouldn't organize a very pessimistic session here because expectations may come true. And taking into account that many of the risks we are discussing are man-made, and if we also quote Churchill, and I also read the book of Mr. Tooze, and I liked it very much, I think Churchill said that Americans select the policy after they try all others. I think it's as a broader relevance, to the big number of countries, economic agencies and governments. And in principle, there are ways out of the situation without serious upheavals. And yes, you're right, I agree that crisis is a natural thing, natural part of the economic development, but on the other hand, there is a country of Australia, where recession hasn't been for 27 or 28 years. And by the way, in the technological development, we shouldn't say that this is a lagging behind country or, well, in principle, it's possible to find, well, it's on the other part of the world. It's absolutely different, everything there. Well, I'm not sure. Poland, for instance, in our part of the world, they haven't had a recession for quite a long period. Well, if the policy reacts in online mode quickly, there could be slowdowns. But if you react properly and quickly and carry out specific changes and good changes, right changes, you can avoid hard effects. I have only 10 minutes. I ask only 2 minutes each. Please, Mrs. Ansosh, you wanted to say something. And what would be the recession, on your opinion?
First, let me come back to the issue of debt. It's true, any debt level can be sustained, like Japan shows, until the financing shock comes. And that's exactly what we worry about. A higher debt level just makes some countries more vulnerable to financing shocks. And this is much more common than is generally perceived. The majority of emerging markets is now less well prepared for the next financing shock than it was 10 years ago. So in 2/3 of emerging markets and developing economies, government debt levels are now 10 percentage points of GDP higher than they were 2008. It just makes it more difficult to weather the next financing shock. So coming back then to your question on recessions, we don't see a recession, but that is a low probability, high impact kind of risk. So it's exactly one of the risk scenarios one could envision. And it tends to come with sharp slowdowns or recessions in the large economies. For example, the global economy has had 4 global recessions since the 1960s, and 8 of them were accompanied by US recessions. So when the US catches a cold, the world tends to catch a cold. Same with China. When China slows sharply, at this point, so many emerging markets are deeply exposed to Chinese trade, to Chinese FDI, that this will be felt around the world. But it's not in our baseline.
Вот международные банки, международные организации точно не нужно.
World banks shouldn't be asked when next recession would come. They normally, mention it after 6 months after it happened, or 12 months. Now the example about World Bank, I just recently read their Analytical on Turkey. They have a forecast that the growth will slow down by 1%, and the results of Q4 is 6% drop, 4%, and now they very conservative analysts. They are very cautious in their statements. Mr. Tuz, question to you. Can I direct a question to you about recession? And one thing I wanted to ask you, but I didn't have time, just a very short comment if possible. Donald Trump was mentioned, and policy, trade wars. You are coming from the UK. There is another story as Brexit. These trends, the populism in politics, can they coexist with the normal economic growth and stable markets, or is it a factor which leads, as Mrs. Yudaeva mentioned, to high volatility?
The populism question is inescapable. It always gets you in the end. I don't like the term populism because it's sometimes difficult to distinguish from simply vigorous and over-enthusiastic democratic politics. I think it's much more useful to differentiate between left-wing radicalism and nationalism, which is in fact the truly dangerous threat which the liberal order faces at this current moment. Stepping back, I think you'd have to say from a historical point of view that the question that you're basically asking, namely about the compatibility between democracy and capitalism, has long been waited to be posed. For most of the 19th century and for a large part of the 20th century as well, it was evident that they didn't go well together. In fact, a regime not a very long way away from here was based on the premise that they were fundamentally incompatible. And down to the 1970s, our colleague here was invoking the crises of the 70s. They weren't simply technological or to do with oil. It was the last great burst of class warfare that Europe and indeed the United States witnessed. What we're seeing now is a return of that old problem. What makes it different, I think, from earlier periods is that it no longer really, in the vast majority of cases, is carried by an organized labor movement. What we in fact lack today are the institutions of classic trade union bargaining, of representation. Those struggles which dominated the 20th century have gone. And unfortunately, in some ways, of course, that represents a victory for liberalism, and capitalism is triumphant and lived for 20 years with the optimistic assumption that there were no enemies therefore. The problem is when you do not have the structuring device of social democracy and its rationalism, because social democracy is a fundamentally rational politics, the other kind of politics that emerges in that space may be even more toxic to liberalism. And I think that's the challenge that we face in the present. Having won a too complete victory over social democracy, the vacuum that emerges is a space filled by all sorts of crazy superstition.
Mr. Aho.
Future risks. There are many methods to prepare for risks, but I don't know if there is any crisis which has been taking place simultaneously when we have high productivity growth. I don't think that always when crises are hit, they are hit when growth goes down and productivity growth especially is going down. And if you look at this silver economy, China is becoming silver economy as well. Japan is already, Europe is already silver economy, Russia is going to be a silver economy, the United States will be a silver economy. In the silver economy, you have only one way to create economic growth, and that is productivity. And again, I want to be optimistic. We have a lot of potential now with modern technologies. Artificial intelligence, all the digital applications will provide us tools to have growth, even when people are getting older and even when global economy is, let's say, unstable.
Mr. Tooze, so a short answer on recession. What is it going to look like?
Well, I think there are two scenarios. One is the conventional scenario you've alluded to, a slowdown. The only, I think, more radical vision involves basically unknown unknowns in China. And we have to register, I think, the extraordinary shift that has taken place. I mean, that we now discuss the details of People's Bank of China monetary policy as a central preoccupation of the global policymaking community. That, as every econometric estimate now shows, a downturn in China, a hard landing in China, would be the most severe shock for global commodity exporters in East Asia. This is radically historically new. And as recently as 10 years ago, it wasn't yet the case, because China was very rapidly growing, it was more rapidly growing, but the logic of compound growth means it was a smaller aggregate growing faster, so its net impact on the world economy was in fact smaller. So even if China should retreat to a 4% per annum growth rate at its current size, it will be a world historic transformation. And if India accelerates and reaches, large scale, the same will be true. So I think that's what we really have to bear in mind in our efforts to assess this risk, is we've never really dealt with a situation like that. In 2008, our worry was the Chinese would sell US dollars and precipitate a crisis that way. In 2015, we saw a run out of the Chinese currency. We saw capital flight out of China, not the other way around. These are unprecedented configurations, and everything, of course, hangs on the capacity of the Beijing administration to manage this. We are hoping for a Communist Party dominant regime to display levels of technocratic competence that no one in the West has ever seen.
Mr. Frenkel, had you still headed the Bank of Israel, what kind of a recession would you be getting prepared for?
There are three phases when you deal with challenge: crisis prevention, crisis management, and crisis resolution. The most important one is crisis prevention, which is also the most boring one, because, as they say, there is nothing like a crisis to sharpen the mind, and there is nothing like sailing safely to put people to sleep and to be sanguine. So my concern is that things have been too good, in the sense that it looks like, look at the numbers. If you don't read the news, or you only read the numbers look very good. And they hide, occasionally, a lot of fragility, primarily coming from the area of debt. If a recession does, or significant slowdown comes up, my concern is that we are less ready than before. But I don't want to be misunderstood. Our financial system is much stronger than before. Bank capital is much more robust. Bank leverage is less pronounced. Bank liquidity is more in place. We have a better understanding of all of that. But that's not what I mean, less prepared. What I mean is that the policy tools and the ammunition that these tools have are less in place. When the previous crisis erupted, all countries could take interest rates which were at some level, lowering them to close to zero. They were stuck too low for too long, and today there is nowhere to go down. Public debt, and most countries expanded their budget spending beyond any rules because it was defined as unconventional, and that has increased significantly. It is now more stretched. In fact, the study that was published only yesterday by the Institute of International Finance gave some update about the size of debt today in the world. So global debt today is $244 trillion. Trillion. It's more than 300% of GDP. It has increased by 12% over the past 2 years. So the That is normally a good thing because it enables you to bridge the future to the present, provided you do the right thing with it, and we know all of these things. So vulnerability is there. The BIS and the Institute of International Finance, but more so the BIS, have alerted the policymakers for a long time about the dangers of excessive debt. And one of the rationales for normalization of interest rates is to prepare ammunition for the next round. And hopefully it will not be very soon. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Может быть...
Thank you very much, and maybe as the very brief outcome of our discussion is quite obvious that the risks are significant. And options of of a recession are possible, but hopefully the things which are handmade, self-induced scenarios will be not as big, not as tough. Thank you very much, dearest ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, our audience, and thanks to all those who have been a part of this discussion. Have a great day, and hope that the pilots will come to a truce.